Welcome to the CAPE lecture series. My name is Deng Chu. I'm the director of the CAPE. Today, we are very honored to have Dr. Bryan Reimer from MIT AgeLab and also for the New England Transportation Center. Dr. Reimer is an expert in the automotive driving. So he has a very long bio, and I only select a few sentences to read it. He's a research scientist in the MIT AgeLab and the associate director of the New England University Transportation Center. His work aims to find the solutions to the next generation of human factors challenges associated with driver attention management, distraction, automation, and the use of advanced driver assistance system to maximize mobility and safety. He collaborates with industries worldwide and founded and leads the Advanced Human Factors Evaluator for Attentional Demand, the AHEAD consortium, aimed at developing the next generation of driver attention measurement tools, and the Advanced Vehicle Technology, AVT consortium, focused on developing an understanding of driver use of emerging vehicle technologies, including production-level automated driving systems. Dr. Reimer has been honored with an inaugural 2018 Autos 2050 Impact Award for his innovative contributions to the automotive industry. He's an author on over 200 technical contributions in transportation and the related human factors area. He's a graduate of University of Rhode Island with a BS in Industrial Engineering, a master's degree in Manufacturing Engineering, and a Ph.D. in Industrial and Manufacturing Engineering. Dr. Reimer.
Thank you. So what do? I don't know. I watch cars drive around a lot. And I hope for some time that we keep driving cars. But the reality of the situation is that automation will play an increasing role in the evolution of auto safety and mobility forward. And as I think you'll come to realize through the talk today, this is not a change that's been instantaneous. It's a change that's been growing over time. In my role at MIT, I'll explain in a tiny bit more detail of some of the really 5 or 6 really big areas that the group that I lead focuses on. I lead about 20, 25 people, mostly professional staff, a few students, in areas largely defined in 3 buckets: behavioral analytical work related to driving, human factors related to driving, and really advanced AI and perception, mostly related again to driving. Why driving? Because at the end of the day, driving is an incredibly complex activity that many of us partake in any one given day, and somehow through the element of luck and good decision making, we get from point A to point B in a chaotic environment safely. And we all believe we're experts. So what better environment to really study human behavior? Because by golly, 85% or 90% of us are not expert drivers. Some small fraction perhaps are. So as Professor Dapping talked about, I lead 2 large consortiums. The first we'll talk about mostly today is the Advanced Vehicle Technologies Consortium. We're really trying to understand how people are adapting to automated driving systems in the wild today. And as you'll see in some videos, that we are really moving down that tippy point of are we drivers or are we passengers very quickly in the current technologies in the market. Second, really focused on human attention and how do we look at measuring human attention in new ways in the concept of the vehicle. I won't go into much depth here today. It's a talk for another day or week. But largely speaking, the element of attention management in the vehicle has been a very understudied and underappreciated area over the last several decades. Government funding in the US is one large degree to that, and some decisions that were made about 2 decades ago. Third, we do a lot of work in more traditional aspects of driver workload evaluation. System A is more demanding than System B. And we're looking at physiology, peripheral physiology in particular, heart rate and skin conductance. We've probably done more work than anywhere else in the world looking at reactivity to different situations in both field and simulation conditions. In the context of highly automated vehicles, I interact in some different policy arenas. Talk frequently about some of the human-centered aspects to building trust and really a trusted ecosystem for automation. Trust is built over time. It's not created instantaneously. That means if you're going to trust the system that's around you, you grow to trust that. And it's eroded very quickly. How do we begin to understand the situation that's around us to a degree that's necessitated by some shedding of the operational task to automation? Looking at nonverbal communication between road users, saying, okay, if there is no longer a driver in the vehicle, how do we begin to communicate differently with that vehicle? Do we need to communicate differently with that vehicle? And then finally, looking at some of the trust and adoption aspects. One of the pieces was recently done in this area is a commentary in Nature talking about driverless is not humanless. We're changing the role of work as we automate. As we've known for decades, automation changes the nature of work. It doesn't replace that. So when you take taxi drivers out of the vehicle, there's going to be new professions created on where some of these individuals go, from software engineering all the way down to cleaning the cars. Changes the nature of work. Finally, applications in deep learning, really the two core aspects being driver monitoring and some innovative work there I'll share a piece of, and then finally external scene perception, doing some work that's public with Toyota in particular, really looking at next generation advanced driver assistance systems and looking how we can push the bounds on some of the image processing work that's been done before through new approaches in neural networks. So, as I said earlier, this is an evolution. First press mention of driverless vehicles was in 1926 that you can dig up through Google. And that concept, it's the concept of teleoperation. So, a phantom motor car will haunt the streets of Milwaukee today. Driverless, it will start its own motor, throw its clutch, ... This concept of we're going to automate the car and there's not going to be a driver in here is, frankly, in round numbers, almost as old as the car itself. Now, yes, it's changed over time. In particularly, 50s, General Motors put a lot of work into this topic there. It was centered very much around the World's Fair. In the 80s, a bunch of prototypes. But really the tipping point in automation today is the DARPA Urban Challenges in the US, where the Defense Department in the US came and really stimulated the concept of can you develop robot entities, and pronounced the DARPA Urban Challenge was really the culmination of that. But what most people don't realize, the art of the DARPA programs that really have led to the modern era of driverless vehicles was nothing about the automation of the vehicle itself. It was about war games. How do you develop soldier strategies to deal with robotic entities? So what DARPA was doing here while stimulating the growth of the modern era of driverless was really about thinking about how do you build battlefield scenarios with robots. So most people don't realize that outside the DARPA Urban Challenge was a military tent looking at how the robots made decisions. That was the fundamental that DARPA was looking for. Well, from there, it's all easy history. The Google self-driving team was really born out of a combination of a number of events, Sebastian Thrun being the original leader there, Chris Urmson being really the follow-up, and Waymo as we know it today with hundreds of vehicles in operation. In the 9 years since, how many $1 billion have been poured into this market and the explosive investment that will continue for a number of years to come here? So quite frankly, it has turned from a dream getting close to 100 years ago to one of the hottest trends in technology over time. But it's not new. So when we think about vehicle automation, it all comes down to definitions and levels. Who here has heard about the SAE levels of automation? Anybody? Society of Automotive, I see, show of hands here. I see a couple faces. 2, that's it, 3, 4, Okay, so the engineers, the Society of Automotive Engineers, come together and developed levels of automation by engineering definitions that even the engineers can't agree on. One of my colleagues at MIT is a member of the committee, and it's quite hilarious that even the committee members themselves can't agree on what these definitions are half the time. So let's for a moment throw out the Society of Automotive Engineers levels of automation, because quite frankly they are going to get thrown out. The question is when. When no one can understand the definition, it's time to start over. There's a couple different types of automation we want to think about. First about it's collaborative automation. We are interacting with the automated system. It's meant to collaborate with us. Okay? Second, there is part-time self-driving systems. Okay? You give responsibility to the system for a period of time, it has full responsibility. On our way to that may be some supervisory automation, okay, where we're in charge of supervising the automation, but that's a transitional period of time. Our goal is not to supervise it. Our goal is to replace us for periods of time. Whether that's parking the car, whether that's on a highway, that doesn't matter right now. It's part-time. We drive part of the time, the AI drives part of the time. And then full-time self-driving or driverless. As in, there is no longer a need for a driver in the vehicle under all conditions. Doesn't mean there's not an operator someplace. The likelihood there will be teleoperation in the backbone of this. So thinking about we collaborate or we're replaced, either part of the time or full time. Now, it all comes down to the end of the day, the context of an operational design domain. Where is this system designed to work? Most of the systems that we think about, and to get it to my driveway perhaps, no, we can't have an operational domain that's enormous. Got to start in a few streets. Okay, what's Waymo working on? In Phoenix, they're working on about 100 miles of road. That's a big operational design domain at the end of the day. But it is far smaller than a country or even a broad city. In many of the companies that you hear about in the news, the operational design domain they're trying to work on is very simplistic domains. We all in this room today can create a highly automated vehicle that works in a very defined operational domain. But in terms of achieving automation, we did it. It just can't deal with the sidewalks, the pedestrians, or the rest of the traffic. So the context of achieving automation is easy. It's easy to demonstrate. That's why you see so much of it on the news. But is the box big enough that it's practical? So, no question. Advances in sensing, mapping, and path planning over the last decade have been immense. The enablers between those who are actually doing the automation and adapting, as we were talking about, the hot air, perhaps, that culminates in a lot of the others. So when we think about automation, really at the end of the day, think about the design domain. Where is this automation supposed to work for me? And that will tell you how robust the automation is, if it can work there or not, or if that's a 1 mile stretch of road, a soccer, or as you would call it, football field, or even smaller in some situations. Okay. So when we think about automation, as I said earlier, it's an evolving process. Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point, is how I like to frame the tipping point in automation. To me, has absolutely nothing to do with the Google self-driving car program, the DARPA Urban Challenge. Automation, to me, the tipping point is the automatic transmission. It wasn't the first element of automation in the vehicle, whether that's ABS, power steering, all elements of automation. But what did the manual transmission do? Okay, again, wrong side of the car here from the UK. It freed my hand from hitting on the shifter, my foot from the clutch, my mind from thinking about what the RPMs of the car were doing, and what it did, it freed resources to do other things. What does automation do? Change the nature of work. So what did we do with this newfound freedom when we no longer had a shift? We picked up the phone. So if you think about what distracted driving has become, it's in a freedom of the expense of automation. Now, why do I say automatic transmissions is the tipping point? Well, because that's what really allowed the hand to come off the clutch, come up. But let's think, if we didn't have power steering, which is also automation, power steering is the only reason you don't have two hands tugging at the wheel. Okay? So the act of anybody driving a farm tractor without power steering realizes that at the end of the day, it takes a lot of work without the assistance of automation. So a number of years ago now, about 4 years ago, began to say we know too little about how advanced technologies, including automation, are being used in the real world. We talk about it in the lab. We look at it in small-scale little experiments, but how are people in their own vehicles, or even vehicles that we give them with high technologies, how are they behaving? What are they doing in these cars differently? What are they doing that aligns with the designer's mental model? What are they doing that doesn't align? So how do we begin to think of how the human interacts with the technology in different operating environments? Because we know environment is a big facet here. Let's call this the driver-technology interaction dynamic that impacts how we use technology or not, and where we may use that. So in the last 3 years, roughly, we've collected, and this figure is a little dated here, north of about 400,000 miles of naturalistic driving data in really two classes of vehicles. First of all, a purely naturalistic fleet of Tesla owners who are driving in their own vehicles, and we are literally watching everything they do in the car through video imagery and telemetry for a year or more. Second, in some vehicles, Land Rover Evoques, Volvo S90s, and we're just starting with some Cadillac CT6s, taking a vehicle with new technology, giving it to a random individual or randomized individual, and seeing, okay, now you were given a car with a set of advanced technologies. How do you adapt to that? How do you leverage this technology? Where do you leverage this? What can we understand about the learning process associated with the adaptation to higher levels of autonomy in the car? Okay? So the question becomes not what we can simulate, not what we can model. What does the real world begin to tell us? Now, so first of all, we see lots of people in modern cars. This is a fisheye view coming from inside the cab of the car. There's also a forward camera here looking at the forward road, and you can see the base of a camera that's pointed at the driver's face. So lots of time in very new, high technology vehicles, people are driving the old-fashioned way. Lots of time they're doing what Elon Musk would like to believe is the right answer in how to use autopilot, paying attention to the road. In this case, hands on the lap. So for those of you who don't realize it, look, hands-free driving is here. I think you'd be shocked at how much of it's here, at least in the US market. Well, if you no longer have to have your hands on the wheel, would anybody like to guess what we do with our hands a lot of times? I see smiles. Not surprising. Now the bigger question becomes, is this safe or unsafe? Because you're no longer responsible for the same longitudinal and lateral control of the car. Automation's taking care of some of that. Yes, you still have supervisory responsibilities, but it is a new safety equation that we don't understand. So the first thing, people say, well, he's texting and driving, that must be bad. We don't know. Because he's texting and collaborating with the automation to drive. He's still responsible for strategic and tactical decisions, but not responsible for the same control decisions. So it opens a whole question of where safety is. Now, if you listen to the news, Elon Musk will tell you that driving with autopilot is safer than driving a conventional car. And you know what? NHTSA 2 years ago even sort of endorsed that. Is it? We don't know. A couple crashes in California don't tell us anything about safety. Quite frankly, based upon US statistics alone, once every 85 million miles, you expect a fatality. Very simply. Number of miles traveled divided by the number of fatalities. Okay, obviously, whether it's highway, city begins to facet. So, are you seeing fatalities that are greater or less than expectations? Now, unfortunately, we don't have the data on what expectations should be. That alone is quite difficult. Nor does one or two accidents, fatalities create the trend. We need to begin to assemble this data over time to begin to understand, is this a good or bad thing? Now, the reality is much less likely this individual is going to fall asleep at the wheel in the middle of the night. That has positive effects. So this isn't the only company doing this. This is GM's Supercruise system, which I do not believe is here in the UK yet. Okay, this is GM's version of autopilot that has been constructed a little bit differently than autopilot. So autopilot is a pure vision radar-based system that literally learns. There's no question about it. The data is being pushed back up to the cloud. They're redeveloping algorithms and pumping that back down. Supercruise, on the other hand, is been developed on a LiDAR mapping of the US interstate system, so it knows where lanes end, it knows where lanes begin, it knows which lane it's in. Okay? Autopilot doesn't know if you're in the right lane or the left lane, it just knows you're in a lane. It's also been developed with a, we'll call it early stage driver sensing system. There's a little camera right here, and a feedback mechanism that includes the green bar on the steering wheel, as well as haptics in the seat, and has been staged with really 3 stages of alarm. First stage is the light begins to blink when you're not paying attention enough, then it goes red, the vibrating seat kicks in, and finally, if you really don't pay attention, the OnStar agent comes in and starts yelling at you. And GM's, a couple papers on it here, has really developed a philosophy that says basically, you know, if the red bar comes out and the system gets turned off and you take control, okay, you have to turn it back on. That penalty alone keeps people from waiting too long. And if the agent comes on, you get locked out of the system for an ignition cycle, and they believe that that's enough penalty to make sure that the OnStar agent never shows up. So they begin a carrot reward system to try to encourage use of the technology. In particular, there's lots of integral differences on the foundations of how this technology is developed, but these are 2 illustrations of hands-free driving that are occurring in the US marketplace. So the bigger question becomes when we look broadly at system utilization. And this here, for those of you familiar with Massachusetts, this is Eastern Massachusetts. The blue lines are autopilot-enabled trips overlaid on the red lines that are manual control trips. So the first thing we very much notice very quickly is that most of the blue lines seem to align with interstate driving. In essence, not surprisingly, the operational design domain for autopilot is primarily highway. Where do people most likely use it? The highway. But we do realize there are lots of instances in here where it's being used off the highway. Okay. Now, there's lots of data in the news on how frequently this is used. Elon Musk, I think, has been quoted recently talking at autopilot's being used somewhere around 35–40% of the miles traveled in autopilot-equipped vehicles. I can't give you a factual number of what our data is, but I can tell you that Elon's not off by far. Okay. The real interesting pieces become how do we transition responsibility back and forth between the automation, back and not. So in our data set right now, we have about 40,000 transition of responsibility of the human giving responsibility to the automation and the automation giving responsibility back from the human. Okay? Lots of laboratory work that's been done in this area, lots of experimental work that's still being done. And the real interesting part of real world data is you begin to validate what makes sense from the laboratory and what doesn't. Because any laboratory or experimental work that is done in isolation doesn't necessarily tell us scientific understanding to what we like. The nature of science, in essence, is replication, and in driving, replication in different environments, in different experimental contexts, is critical to understanding what happens outside. And then the real world, at the end of it, is the true testament of time. So when we look at transitions of responsibility, we see that humans initiate transitions for lots of different reasons. You're coming to an exit. You want to drive again. There's traffic. There's a lane change situation or a lane that's disappearing. A new lane is created. There are situations that you perceive to be too complex for the AI. All characteristics of situations where the human says, hey, I want to drive now. And what we see is people are doing a fantastic job of projecting their awareness of the operating environment forward and actually managing the automation in ways that is far better than we expect. Now, you also have the situation where the machine says, hey, something's wrong, you take over now. And we see a small number of those situations in the data. Interestingly enough, in most of those situations, the human appears fairly attentive and taking over very quickly, suggesting that some of the research literature out there that suggests that handovers are going to be seconds to dozens of seconds You know, maybe if we're sleeping, but even if we're texting, we seem to be able to take the responsibility of collaborative automation well. Now, in other vehicles, and this is a Volvo S90, you see lots of alarms going off in the car. So here you have a forward collision alarm. She doesn't know what's going on. What's the alarm? An element of feedback coming from the automation systems. Sensing. Okay, you'll hear in a moment. Parking assistance. Putting more beeps in there. Okay.
Yeah, that's an idea, huh? Nice raccoon.
Somebody wanted subjects.
What? What are you thinking about? That's the copy. What the heck is he thinking to me about?
That's the automation saying you're not braking hard enough. We're going to brake harder for you. And when you don't understand an automation, what do? You search for a solution. Does anybody remember the Toyota floor mat incidents? Well, sunk in the mind. Looking for the floor mat next year. Okay, unexpected. The automation is working here in the way it was designed, but the education. One of the myths about automation is as you automate more, you need less human expertise. It's a myth. As you automate more, you need to increase expertise. Education is a key component. So when we look at what people are doing in cars, we can look at, in this illustration here, just manipulation of the smartphone in about 500 hours of driving in one of our vehicles. The vehicle is actually meaningless here. So the concept being is about 10% of the time when the car is in drive but not moving, what are you doing? Something with the smartphone. You're actually, okay, not texting necessarily, not emailing necessarily, not surfing the web. Manipulating the phone is the broader category. As you start moving, up to about 5 miles an hour, it drops to about 5%. And when you're at highway speed, not surprisingly, you pay more attention. Okay, the curve is not surprising. It's a little higher than many people would like, but perhaps the surprising curve is this one. The act of holding the phone. I'm not doing anything with this, but I'm holding it. How many people here have the phone in their hand right now? I see 2. Anybody else willing to admit?
Well,
okay.
I'm taking notes.
Okay, that's good. You're manipulating. You're not holding. So conceptually, what my kids would call this is a lovey, an affectionate object that I can't put down. About 5%, a little more than 5% of the time, drops off its speed a little bit. The phone is sitting in the hand at the ready. I can't put it down. I feel compelled to keep this thing close. It's part of my life. So which means there's good things. When you slam on the brakes, if the phone was on the passenger seat, actually it's this side here, it flies on the floor and it's down in the footwell, right? But the good part of it is if it's your hand, you don't have to worry about fumbling to get it. On the other hand, if you need 2 hands to drive at any point in time, you're kind of blocked with something there. So this device has changed completely our relationship with technology on a moment-to-moment basis, and we could talk about the broader aspects of that for days. But in the car, it's sitting there at the ready. Someone might text, someone might call. I can't put this thing down. And here's how we use them sometimes. This is an element of voice texting.
I've been in the car for 2 hours. See, you know? Cancel.
Notice her eyes.
Been in the car for 2 hours, seen 3 accidents, and been slipping and sliding everywhere. Yes.
Is this texting?
text him again. Sean. Probably shouldn't be texting, but I'm using Siri, so it's okay.
So great, I'm using voice. That makes this okay. Now, picked up the phone and called, the length of the interaction would be probably far shorter. Quite frankly, even if you would text the manual way, there'd probably be less offer or glance time involved in this situation. You know, she is clearly looking at the phone pretty heavily here. Better yet, let's take this phone out here, use Lee's screen here, and amplify the size of this text a little bit. Because one of the myths about voice is voice goes back and forth in technology, but it's really multimodal. We look for the visual confirmation here that the thing's actually hearing me. It's doing what I'm telling it to do. So when we think about, and we ask people about cars today, and we do interviews that go along with this data, you know, I think this quote summarizes it pretty well. There's a lot of emotional benefits that come with these cars because of a perception of safety. Don't know if it's true or not. I was much more aware of how distracted I am. I also found myself using the safety features to my advantage to be more distracted. So the big question is here, are we building a safer system by protecting people with the perception of safety? Or are they taking that advantage and risk homeostasis at its best kicking in? Because I feel more protected, I will take more risk. Okay, a couple quotes that I had in the front of USA Today in the US a couple weeks ago. These systems are designed not only for ideal environments like good weather and clear lane markings, but also for rational behavior. Humans are predictably irrational. That means we do things that we really know we shouldn't be doing. And we do them repetitively. That's why it's predictable. Engineers don't build things well for irrational behavior, even though it's predictable. So that means, does the automation begin to work so well and require so little of you that by solving one safety problem, you create another? And how do we be sure that the net sum of these systems all moves into a productive, positive direction? So I'm not saying don't automate. You got to look at the automation as a whole. What is it solving and what is it promoting together, as opposed to being a silver bullet, may you say. So a couple snippets from the head work here, taking what's been classically the distraction perspective and saying, hey, great, you were texting prior to the crash. Hey, there's nothing I can do with that. You were looking down off the road at the wrong time. Great. Some of the work we've been doing with Lee and other colleagues is saying, okay, what's happening upstream of the event? In the seconds, or even further up, dozens and minutes prior to the event, that gives us an indication of downstream consequences. In essence, you've been texting for a while that led to the crash. So it's not this text that was the problem, the fact that you started texting upstream. And some of this work, and I'm in the name of time, not going to go too deep, basically leads to a new model that begins to say that, look, when you look away from the road, you lose awareness. When you look at the road, you gain awareness. You have to look at the road long enough to understand the situation that's going on around you to afford the glances away from the road. And there's a couple papers out there right now, and if anybody's interested in them, just email me, that begin to draw this kind of model forward and ground it in actual crash data, showing that those who crash have lower buffer profiles, suggesting that they are looking off the road less strategically than those who avoid crashes. In essence, a model such as this has groundings in safety much deeper than where the auto industry has been largely designing for the last 20 plus years. Where they've been designing is trying to minimize glances off the road. Never designed to think about that you have to look at the road long enough to afford the time to look away. In essence, you need to build a mental representation of the world before you look down. Now, actually I did pull one of the pictures up here, sorry. Glance profile, buffer profile of those who get into a near crash situation, buffer profile of those who get into a crash situation. And this is the first of a couple papers in this area. This data here that this is drawn upon was collected about 15 years ago out of the 100-car naturalistic data set at Virginia Tech. So in essence, we can see 10, 15 seconds prior to the crash that there's a change in attentional profile. I can do things up here about managing attention. I can't do anything right here. So we can also begin to bring cognitive activities into this. PEEPS that was just presented at CHI 2 weeks ago looks at using the dynamic movements of the right eyeball as a metric in which we can see with accuracy of about 86% a 3-class classification problem into low, medium, and high cognitive load. In essence, as we think more, the brain's working more, we scan the world around us less. We become more concentrated in our gaze. So we're looking much more at a central focus of the car in front of us. Using the eyeball and the dynamic movements of the eyeball, we can begin to determine some of those movement parameters in ways that we could never perceive before using classic vision techniques. Bringing this all together, it begins to think about the concept of really developing human-centered attention management. How do you help us make better moment-to-moment decisions? So that means that we need to look at a functional view of driver attention that looks at the system as a whole and the impact of the components to safety. And practically speaking, you can't solve distraction alone without thinking about the drowsy driving and the technology influx problem altogether. Because the best countermeasure to falling asleep at the wheel is probably picking up the phone and calling somebody. If you are overloaded, you don't want to alert and alarm. That only throws us further into the overload category. You need to calm the individual down and recenter them. This is the basics of Yertzes-Dotson work. When you're underload side, the alarming side and the alerting side can help more. So in essence, when you're really stressed and you can't find things and the alarm goes off, what are you doing? You're searching, you can't focus. The brain can only handle so much. Over that threshold, performance begins to drop. So a couple just aspects of some other work that we're doing. Here, developing full scene segmentation approaches to feed into neural networks, really focused on how to ensure the video is not coming across the projector as well. Really focused on how do we annotate large-scale data to fuel into the perception models where cars are trying to determine, in this instance, is this a car in front of me? Is this a person? Is this a cyclist? Etc. Second, end-to-end networks. Here, taking the pixels of the image in, computing our own learn control decision based upon the pixels, looking at how our learn control system relates to autopilot, which is its own perception control system, and doing comparative functions. Based upon the divergence of these functions, we can predict quite accurately the likelihood of a human to decide he needs to take over. In essence, humans are being proactive in their awareness of the environment, much like the AI is, and seeing something's changing out there in the pixels and making appropriate decisions based upon that. Finally, using deep reinforcement learning to look and try to develop AI systems that learn to avoid accidents. If you had the video of all the accidents in the world, can you train an AI system what it's like to avoid? In some sense, the answer theoretically is probably better than we can. As we were talking about earlier, AI systems don't forget in the same way humans do. They learn over time. Now, the hard part is that we expect robots to be perfect, and robots aren't perfect. They're not going to be perfect. So the question becomes is how good do they have to get until we can accept the consequences of robotic failure. Some other work looking at pedestrian movements where we took 250,000 miles of data and extracted the jaywalking pedestrians out of that. And you'll see people moving over into the road to try to understand what is the decision process and the communication process between the pedestrian and the car as pedestrians step into the roadway. So when we think about the future for a minute here, we can think about something that's quite scary. We as humans are experiential learners. That means we learn by doing. That means as we drive, and today vehicles miles traveled is approximately equal to vehicles miles driven. We experience situations, we learn from them, and we adapt. In the future, VMT, vehicles miles traveled, is going to be not equal to vehicles miles driven. And again, only a small percentage of the miles right now are not driven. Well, what does that mean? The future is one of novice drivers. Novice drivers are not terribly good at making strong decisions. Even the Federal Aviation Administration in the US has admitted that pilot skill has eroded at the expense of automation in the cockpit. And that is where you have an immense training regimen to keep skill ready. Second, as I talked about earlier, the context of predictably irrational. In many countries of the world, driving is looked at as a right versus a privilege. In other countries, it's much more of a privilege. So what that means is that when it becomes a right, it is something that is rarely taken away in the time frames that it should be. It's easy to remove the privilege to drive. It's harder to remove a right to drive. That means that there is a set of situations that people are going to continually engross themselves in that will be very, very difficult to engineer for. Driving 100 miles an hour up the highway is not rational. But yet the likelihood of me losing my right to drive is very low. If I did lose my privilege more frequently, I probably wouldn't do that kind of behavior. Now, think of a society such as Sweden. Driving is much more of a privilege than a right. In the US, much more of a right. Obviously, a continuum here. So, one question that gets raised in US policy right now is vehicle automation really a traditional policy focus? And I would argue strongly no. And I actually have a TED Talk in a few weeks. I'll talk about this more. Now, that means that we shouldn't take necessarily our traditional automotive regulatory structure and move that regulatory structure for automation. Perhaps we need to be thinking about automation and the need for a new regulatory structure to support that. In the US, does this mean that automated vehicles are guided through a completely redefined regulatory structure that's within or outside the US Department of Transportation? Same thing would basically exist here in the UK. How can governments and manufacturers work together to develop the needed pathways here? Because the expertise to do it is not on the public sector, it's in the private sector. But the trust is much more in the public sector. Bringing these entities together through public-private partnerships is probably the one of the more strategic ways to move this. And the ultimate question becomes, how safe is safe enough? So when we think about success to automation, everybody says, we're going to automate, we're going to automate, we're going to automate. Great. What does success look like? Is that a system that encompasses hands-free driving such as we have today? Is that autonomous mobility on demand without safety drivers, a robo-taxi? Is it a mobility ecosystem that provides seamless intermodal connectivity between rail and the front door? Or perhaps something that meets a safety threshold? We haven't defined that. I'd argue that profitability, consumer perception of mobility benefits, cost, experience, etc., environmental benefits and safety all link together into some cost function that we have yet to define. And why is this so important? Is a clear understanding of the factors are key to accelerating targeted investments over time. Where the evolution of automation is going to take decades, if you want to keep seeing investment over time, you got to understand what the benefit ratio is. Otherwise, market elements will time out. So when we think about the future, yes, there's probably a strong future for personal ownership where we're going to own cars for a long time to come that will have automated systems in it. I'd argue that we're going to see a new model of fractional ownership increasing, where you actually see people buying cars with their neighbor, per se, to share the mobility benefits of a vehicle because the cost of owning is too high and there are other mobility sources that alleviate the need to own all the time, but you don't want to move all the way to the commercial ownership market or a rental car market. You want to have a little more control of that experience. And that's really going to be a big factor, not in the cities, but in rural environments where, the idea of jumping in a Zip car or an Uber is not the same, but yet I don't need it all the time. Today, the percentage of vehicles that are automated is quite low, but it is non-zero. What's the growth curve look like over time? No one knows time. It's an undefined number, and anybody tells you time, they're clueless in some sense. There is no unknown on time. Is it accelerate up? Does it take time that direction? Or does it do this? Accelerate up, we hit some ceiling and drop on back down. Don't know. So some questions out there. Society's being formed to try to protect our rights to drive with automation involved, but the concept of really trying to protect the right to drive. And other pieces, more recent accidents, opening more questions into this. You know, one critical factor, we sit here in one of the greatest institutions of higher learning, research is going to be key to all of this. That's both corporate research, academic research, government research, and everything in between. So what will the most tragic loss in Arizona result in? At this point, not much. Hopefully it is not quickly forgotten, because the probabilities are certain that a similar incident with lots of different characteristics will result in time. And the more we learn from incident A, the more prepared we can be for incident B. So I'll leave you with a thought. Automation of the vehicle and our life remotes, our phones, because quite frankly, everything I need in life seems to resonate on these days, and it takes care of scheduling my life too. Is this tipping the point between what is the distraction? What we're doing in the car, or the act of driving in and of itself? So in essence, has driving now become the distraction? And we need to look at this problem in a totally different perspective. And an op-ed here written in the Daily Beast a couple weeks ago about from some colleagues and I together. So, one caveat. Actually, one set of summaries first. Humans will continue to have a role for some time. We see a number of use challenges in current vehicles, lots of confusion, robo-taxis are going to emerge, but investment in human-centered engineering is critical. Only where the technology, the policy, and the societal human factors overlap will we win and have technology deployment. If the technology is ready before policy is, not going anywhere. Lots of technologies that sit in the shelf around here in any good, strong academic organization. Why? Because you need the consumer to want it, you need a policy to support it, and the technology there at all the same time. If that doesn't occur, it will not grow. Okay? It may be delayed, it may sit in the shelf forever. So, again, one caveat, all research is not created equal. When you think about research in the driving domain, it has become more and more critical over time to read the methods carefully. There is an enormous amount of literature in this space derived from very different methods that look at the problem very differently. Some of it is very strong. Others is very good academic work that, based upon the limitations of studies, does have effects. But the literature here is exploding so fast that unless we understand how facets come together, do we truly understand the scientific process. Replication across methods being critical to the future success of science and understanding as we look to automate the future away. With that, questions?
Question time.
So a couple of questions. Firstly, I kind of sympathise a lot with a woman who was struggling to understand what all the beeping was for. I work in speech. I wonder why manufacturers don't use speech output more to explain why don't they just have a little message which say what the problem is?
So Autoleave had a demonstration at CES this year. It was a few football fields in size, where they were using speech and other multimodal feedback through their leave concept. You can look it up online to do exactly that. In essence, educate along the way. Because many of us are not willing to sit down for the education beforehand. And human behavior suggests that's going to be hard to correct unless there are significant changes in the regulatory education structures throughout much of the world for a driver's license. So the leave concept was, hey, let's work on the experiential understanding based upon the situation, bringing most of that through voice back, but not all of it, because the multimodal aspects are, in some sense, very important as well. I know they are working with others in the world at this point on to further development of the concept, but I think it's really critical. Honestly, real-time learning. Now, if that card came up and said, hey, this was a brake assist function, it's meant to help you stop faster, you would have minimized all the confusion that exists there. I'm not going to say you wouldn't have a brief period of confusion, but you'd definitely minimize the harm there.
can I ask another question?
Sure.
This is probably more difficult, but so one of the things you brought out is that there are now multiple players involved in controlling a car. There's the driver, there's the automation system, may even be outside controllers who are doing things. Where does, there is an accident and someone gets killed or badly injured, how on earth does anyone sort out the liability?
Supreme Court case in the US. There's no answers. There's a lot of folks who say, well, it's going to follow the traditional traffic law norms of that, hey, it's the offender, it's the driver's responsibility, but that driver is going to launch a lawsuit against the manufacturer who did, there's a whole ugly, class action suits as we put them in the US are going to be very interesting to watch. Now, in the papers, GM, and again, was sued. I don't think it was settled. I haven't seen anything to say it was settled, but it may have been. GM was sued by a motorcyclist that was struck by one of the Cruise cars. The concept being the car behaved in a way that I didn't expect. And the reality is, quite frankly, they do behave in the way you shouldn't expect, and quite frankly, you shouldn't expect them to behave like we do. But conventional law says you behave in a certain pattern, and when you're outside that pattern, you're liable for it. So the whole context of shared responsibility needs to be discussed here in many sense. So it means that the two vehicles that collide both probably share some of the responsibility. And NTSB in the US highlighted that concept quite evidently in the analysis of the Tesla fatality in Florida 2 years ago. And I think in some sense, the recent Waymo crash over the weekend is another illustration of shared responsibility. Could the Waymo vehicle done things to minimize the harm of the collision? Probably. Was it capable today? Probably not. Should it have been? One could argue maybe, but who knows? But the reality is clearly the car that struck was also largely sharing some of this at the end of the day.
One Ben.
So airplane pilots have been flying on autopilot for a long time. Is there any lessons we learned from the airplane industry in regards to de-learning how to fly, things on autopilot and those kind of things?
Yes, more than we can talk about here today. But perhaps the most important thing that can be learned from the aviation industry is the context of safety culture. Is that everybody from the person repairing a bolt on an aircraft engine all the way through the pilot, everybody is responsible for safety, and everybody is entitled to raise their hand and say, stop, let's think about this. And that's the culture that has led to aviation safety as we know it today. The automotive industry is slowly learning the context of safety culture, and it really needs to be learned faster in moving into this. The second is autopilot in the cockpit is licensed under the supervision of a pilot. It is not licensed to fly planes without the pilot. So, the convention here is humans are there to support the automation where it is not strong. The automation is there to support the mundane aspects of most of flying. So the Miracle on the Hudson is the best illustration to think about for a second. In the landing of that plane, the autopilot system would never have done that. The human capability stepped in. I'm not saying that was a lot of luck. It's a miracle. But that's where human expertise comes in. Now, that we've accepted the fact that pilot skills are eroding, and we know the fact that driver skills are eroding, means that perhaps we need to rethink about education and licensure in context of automation. Perhaps to drive an autopilot-equipped vehicle, you may need a different endorsement on your license to say that you are learning, or you're spending the time learning some of the aspects of how to operate the technology. Again, that is the driving right versus privilege piece. Those who have a right to drive don't want to be forced to do more. Those who drive under a privilege are more likely to be educated more. Those are a couple key aspects. But there are books on aviation, human factors, that are being ignored largely by a large number of auto developments. Why? Because automotive feels it's different. But the foundations are quite similar. Not perfectly aligned, but quite similar in many situations.
Thank you for speaking. speech. It's very good. I just have one question. So, as you mentioned, it's like the driverless car may become a distraction in the future. So, what do you think, like the head-up display technology? And do you think it's possible to like projecting information on the phone to the screen, so that people can just see their texting or email on the screen while keep some attention on the road?
Yeah. And I think the most important part of that is that the same technology can be used to highlight salient objects, because the sensing in the car is probably going to be more tuned over time to salient objects. That perhaps allows you to, one, to deprioritize the text on a moment's basis and prioritize other salient objects by highlighting them. Two, perhaps, given that we need to maintain skill, throwing in false alarms at times, to increase the probability that we are paying attention, and then use penalty functions that may be liability insurance incentives, etc., to ensure that we're learning and responding to these things. So I think there's a very rich future for augmented reality and augmented systems in the context of heads-up displays in the car. And I think that may be some of the solutions that are needed long term.
Given the cultural differences between driving styles and what drivers do in the car, to what extent do you think it's useful to, or possible to regulate that at the kind of high international levels?
There's very clear cultural difference. The EU is much harder than the US. I mean, although New England drivers and California drivers are quite different, they're nowhere near as different as Swedish drivers and German drivers. So I think that, you know, the UNEC has to do some guiding principles here, but at the end of the day there are stark differences by country within the EU and I guess just outside of the EU, or soon to be here too. So I think you got to look at the culture of the, region and say some regional differences demand different approaches. That doesn't mean they're black and white, they just may be different shades of gray. Clearly the German system and the Swedish system are one rooted on significant amounts of driver education. You just don't go get a driver's license in Sweden or Germany. You invest thousands of dollars in training and apprenticeship time to get it, because it's treated as a privilege.
Thank you. In your talk, you mentioned in an autopilot system or assisted driving, drivers tend to look at that phone texting, etc., which is not good.
I didn't say that wasn't good.
When under the unsupervised driving, because you have eyes off the road.
So when in the context of shifting your attention over to the phone in the automation scenario, we don't know good or bad, because the automation is offloading driving responsibility.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're not there yet.
It's not what?
We're not there yet.
No, it is offloading driving responsibility. Even Supercruise, Pilot Assist, Autopilot, ProPilot, a couple of other systems out there, they're offloading responsibility. Now, the assumption we make is that safety demands you pay attention to the road just as much as you used to. That's an assumption. I think that is a very open question, and whether the AI systems begin to pick up enough of the moment-to-moment demand that freeing resources to other things ends up at a holistic level becoming safer. I think that's an open question. And it's one that we shouldn't jump beyond. And in context where 1.2, 1.4 million people globally are dying on the roads, we need to be tuned to say zero, while that's maybe a long-term goal, any substantive improvement is the right direction. So if we could reduce traffic fatalities by 5% next year, by golly, let's do it. But that's not good enough in 2020. So we've got to be thinking about this longitudinally.
My question is, in car, there's a lot of multimedia system which acts as an interface between car and human. Are they being investigated to assist in the autopilot? I saw some fractions of it providing some visual feedback, say you need to pay more attention, but there's a whole lot more which can be done.
Yep. Multimodal feedback is key. Now, visual is the primary channel that's been traditionally relied on for a number of reasons, and I think there's a lot of reasons that it will remain the traditional primary channel. But haptics, gesture, voice, auditory alerts, all need to be combined together through more multimodal systems. And there is a lot of movement in that direction. The Cadillac that I put up is probably one of the leaders in haptic seat integration with some novel visual alerts. Okay, why was the white bar put in the steering wheel? Because it raises it up quite high into the visual field. It's hard to ignore there. Incredibly expensive design. Integrated very nicely with the haptic seat.
So we're still assuming that driver's height needs to be kept on the road.
Oriented in that direction. Now, I think an underappreciated feature is peripheral vision. That's a whole other topic as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just have. You could.
Thank you. You talked a lot about evidence and how to be very sensitive to what research shows us. It's very difficult for the government to know who to trust when evidence has been produced, when a lot of that evidence is from the car manufacturers themselves. Do you have any views around how that public-private relationship can improve for the future, mainly for better road safety?
Yeah, and I think that it's a collaborative relationship. We're asking questions of each other, and over time building trust, because good work over time proves itself to be good work. Bad work over time proves itself. So where you develop that trusted relationship over time, that when you ask, how do you interpret this? Over time you begin, they're likely to be giving me a true interpretation based upon their knowledge. That doesn't mean it's always proven to be correct, because there are a lot of unknowns. But the key being is that there's a truthful relationship that's built in that partnership. And I think that can be done, but it is not how things are often done today. It's a very tenacious relationship between the regulators and industry. Now, the reason I think the partnership is so critical is because the technical competence is mostly in the private sector. The cost complexity side is so dominant that it's unlikely to change. That means it is imperative that the public sector find new ways to cultivate needs and standards and regulation. Smart regulation is what can move this industry forward. Nobody, whether that's public sector or private sector, wants poor regulation. And I think the key here is how do you use smart? And I don't think there is actually room for much regulation here right now. Best practices is probably the best we can do. Why? So many unknowns. Which means that this is the best until we know better, is really the best road forward for now. Anything we step in stone is most likely going to be wrong 5 years from now. Too many unknowns. So it's a continual, ongoing, trusted partnership that's key. Now, it's not just industry research either. It goes over to the academic side, because all the academic research is very much in, here are the limitations of what I did, and those limitations are critical. Why? Because we can only experiment with components of the problem.
Thank you. I'm wondering if there is an emergency in the high-speed driving, whose decision have higher priority. We should trust the self-drivers. We should trust the driver's decision or the automation's decision in current technology.
From the liability perspective, it's all the driver's decision at this point. From a algorithmic perspective, in certain situations, the AI is probably better than us. In other situations, we're probably better than the AI. And there is no one easy way of denoting that gray area. So in the situations in high speed where the AI was developed to stop the car, it's probably better than us. But anything outside of those situations, it's an open question.
So first of all, thank you for the talk. So for saying that artificial intelligence is not infallible, to this audience is a bit preaching to the choir. So I think there needs to be more work by the community to actually convince people that, look, sort of robots, AI, they're not perfect. But doesn't this create a catch-22 situation where if people accept that AI is fallible, there will really never be progress, because people would rather have agency on their own driving, or everything really. This argument can be extended to automation and everything.
Good question. Now, I believe that if you can habituate the population to the fact that AI is not perfect, you have, over the long horizon, a better chance of building trust than if you provide falsehoods or allow those falsehoods that exist in the media today to propagate, and situations occur where those falsehoods are proven wrong. So that means building trusted communication as opposed to building false trust. And I think that trusted communication is what gets you over the course of decades to where we want to go. False trust may get you there quick, but remember when I said the curve could go up and drop? Why? False plus false trust, we realize how much air there is holding the curve up. I'm not going to trust this anymore. Trust is built over time, eroded quickly, and when it is eroded, it takes longer to rebuild. So there is no perfect answer. My belief is you're better building it over time with truth and honesty and setting collaborative goals and objectives on why the vision gets us to where we want to be 10, 15, 20 years down the line, or maybe longer.
So just to follow up with a quick question.
Sure.
See, having said all that, having all the technologies and building up the trust, all the things, and it's quite demographic and all the things different with cultures.